Welcome back to another episode of ESSA TV. Today we're joined by Professor Abigail Payne, Director of the Australian Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research, a team of more than 50 academics working to discover and answer questions related to infrastructure policy, healthcare, the gender pay gap, education, and social mobility. Most of our conversation today was regarding aspects of our economy that reach far and wide, far beyond the finance industry or the realm of academic economics. And so this was a really, really important discussion of economic issues that affect everyday Australians. So before we get into it, I'd like to thank you for watching this and giving us your time, and most importantly, thank you, Professor Abigail Payne. So you've written recently about the lack of women in economics and the negative impact this is likely having on Australia's prosperity, whilst also arguing that the government should not necessarily play a heavy hand in promoting job opportunity and equality. So what would you say is in your view, is the best way to encourage gender equality in the workplace, especially in economics and further in academic economics?
Right. So I guess my view is that there are women economists out there, and one of the bigger issues is actually the presence of those women economists. So an important aspect is how do we increase their presence? So for me, the government, universities, and other institutions could be playing a bigger role around opening up opportunities for women to be present. It's also how do we encourage, nurture, mentor women to want to take on those roles. So we can be playing a much bigger role in terms of encouraging women to be economists and to have a voice in the economics arena. Now, why women, why not just men? I think women have a voice. I also think men have a voice. So it's not one over the other. It's we want to have equal representation of those voices, of those opinions. At the same time, I've said we shouldn't be heavy-handed about it, because it's not just about providing opportunities. It's about women taking up those opportunities. So we want to ensure the opportunities are there, but if I look in a sea, I often, let me step back. If I look in the audience, it's not uncommon. I will see a sea of male faces and I don't see the women. So then I have to ask myself, where are the women? Is it that they don't exist, or is it that they're choosing not to attend? If they choose to attend, we need to make sure that it is a conducive environment so that they will get up and they will speak. But if they choose not to speak, that's not my fault. It's their fault in terms of creating that voice. Personally, I'm not a very big out there person. And we do have to play a role in making sure that there is that representation of women. But women also have to step up to the plate.
So
one of the things I've observed is that we have a lot of people that are focused on broader issues. So they focus on labor issues, they'll focus on tax issues, they'll focus on macroeconomic issues, international issues. But what I don't see as much of is kind of the local public economics issues. And at the same time, we observe, cities are growing here, which is really good for economic growth. I think we're doing a pretty good job about alleviating needs around congestions. So I take public transit. I'm pretty happy with the public transit. Could be faster, it could be less congested, but I don't say, oh, it's so overcrowded, I have to wait a half an hour before I catch my tram. So I think there's some, like the local delivery of services, where we could be doing a lot more on. So local delivery of transportation, the public services we're doing. We've talked previously about housing and homelessness. How do we think about housing and homelessness issues? How do we some things like around education. We have snippets of stuff we're doing, but I think there could be a lot more that's being done in terms of how do our cities operate, what's the relationship with our more regional centers, and what's happening across states. So I see limited discussion, limited research around fiscal federalism. I see limited discussion around how city governments are financed, how state governments are financed, and much more emphasis on what's going on across the Commonwealth government. So I think that there's some opportunities here to broaden the study of public economics in Australia. At the same time, that's where you get a little bit of challenges because you only have so many states. Whereas if you look in the US, you have 50 states. So when you start thinking about some of the empirical estimation issues, it can be a bit more challenging.
So, I mean, when I look at the sort of the geographical makeup of Australia and the demographic makeup, I see a lot of parallels with Canada, where you have a few major cities where almost all of the major commercial and the financial activity is happening. Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and then perhaps Edmonton if you're talking about resources. Would you say that there are any lessons that Australia can learn from Canada simply because there is this vast stretch of land that is, really that is useful for resources, and perhaps, but as a challenge beyond that?
So absolutely, I actually think the better parallel for Australia is Canada. A former colleague at McMaster, who's a macroeconomist, showed me this graph just before I came here, where he plotted GDP for Canada and Australia, and there were two lines right on top of each other over time. And I think when you look at Canada and Australia, what do we know? Heavy resource sector, as you say, major cities, large land masses where there are a lot of areas where very few people are living there. The political system is very similar, parliamentary system, although I think Canada has done a better job around keeping its prime ministers in office than Australia has. So there are some strong parallels. And so while at the same time you understand Australia wants to compare itself to the US, I think that there are better synergies if you want to look to policy development, some of the issues, some of the studies to Canada.
Do you think that, you briefly mentioned fiscal federalism, do you believe that this is sort of an area where Australia can learn from, say, the US and Germany that have this sort of a good distribution of their population? There isn't, they're sort of well hedged in terms of the distribution in terms of their major cities. This also, has some downward pressure on housing, whereas if you look at cities like London and Paris, or if you look at Canada, recently the Vancouver and Toronto housing markets were in some serious strain just because of prices going through the roof. Do you believe that perhaps one of the issues is that Australia simply isn't doing enough to support a lot of its smaller cities? Maybe not regional Australia, but maybe the second largest city in every state. Maybe it involves sort of, increasing infrastructure in places like Geelong or places like Newcastle in New South Wales.
That's a tricky question. So I haven't studied this for Australia. You do have to say, that for any given country, they can't just entirely rely on their big cities. And so the smaller cities play an important role. But I think there's an aspect in which you do have to say, well, what are their strengths? What do they want to be? What's their skill set? How do you encourage migration to those areas? So I do think that there's a lot of questions that could be studied and explored, and I would be willing to bet that almost any country has these challenges, right? So, even if I look at the U.S., I can tell you I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, where the three major industries was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, so government, tire industry, and National Cash Register. So two industries where they kind of went through declines in terms of either moving, not needing as big of a workforce, and where I grew up, that city today is much smaller than it was when I was growing up, and the vibrancy of that city is very different today than it was. And some cities are figuring out how to reinvent themselves, and it involves a lot of different players. Now I live in Melbourne, so I can't say what's going on in Geelong because I'm not living there and I'm not in tune with the conversations, what's going on. But I do have to say, what are the level of conversation, what's going on, what are they doing in terms of saying, how do we attract new industry, how do we expand, the industry that's in there, how do we think about the needs of our workforce, how do we think about skill sets. A 50-year-old is going to have a different set of skill sets than a 20-year-old moving into the area. And those present different challenges, and across different countries you will see that there can be challenges. So drawing back on the US, I went to a city conference that took place in Rochester, and Rochester was reinventing itself in some ways with a pre-existing industry that had gone in decline but was raising itself because of some of the natural resources and innovation and patents it had. But the skill set that was needed for that was the more technical skill set. So young people were getting jobs.
This is Rochester, New York, just to be clear.
Yeah. So young people were getting jobs because they had the skill set, but the older people who didn't have the same level of skills were still challenged there in terms of how do we find jobs for these people. So there's, for a given smaller area where there has been a decline in industry or decline in jobs, it's not just about how do you introduce new industries or how do you expand an existing industry, but you have to think about that demographic age dimension in terms of skill sets.
So Jonathan Tepper recently released a book called The Myth of Capitalism, and he he posed an interesting, I suppose, thesis that you're sort of touching on, which is that in a lot of cities, particularly in areas like the industrialized Midwest, you've only got maybe one or two major employers, and they're really the lifeblood of the city. He argued that it was, the assumption is that a lot of monopolies are what's undermining our standard of living, but he argued that it was the opposite. It was a monopsony where you only had one employer in a city, and so they had a lot of power in terms of wages. They had a lot of power in terms of their movement. They could bargain for wage cuts because they were the only employer there.
Right.
There was very little mobility, and so a lot of the workers couldn't just get up and leave and move to North Dakota and get a fracking job. They couldn't just get up and leave and work in tech on the West Coast. Do you think it's a real issue in Australia because no one really moves here? It's a very sclerotic kind of demographically speaking, where generally Australians don't move to other cities for better employment prospects.
I don't know. Right, because I haven't studied Australia, so I'm not going to feel comfortable conjecturing on whether it is or not. And I haven't read his book. And as economists, as somebody who works with data, generally I like the law of large numbers, so I like lots of observations. But I will give you an anecdotal story, and it is anecdotal. Maybe not be replicable, and this is a bit old. 15 years ago, I visited Indianapolis, and Indianapolis is in the Rust Belt, right? And I remember being super impressed because their downtown was vibrant. So I started asking people, I was like, oh, why is this really vibrant? Why is this different from other Midwest cities I've been to? And what I was told was that the major employer in Indianapolis was a pharmaceutical company called Eli Lilly. And supposedly the company realized that in order to attract good senior executives and strong managers, they needed culture, they needed sports, they needed good food, And so they went to the city and they said, okay, we're going to help invest in the city so we have a vibrant city. So, yes, big manufacturers or big companies can try to exert influence on the city fathers. But at the same time, there's also probably other stories where they actually can work together and try to make it a better place. And part of that goes back to issues around ethos, morals, things that, I study in charitable giving. So if you think of the standard model, utility framework for, goods, right? The big issue is how do you think about charitable giving? Because it's not personal consumption, you're giving for somebody else's consumption. And so that's probably where we do kind of have to think about how do we encourage these non-market kind of relationships.
It's always good to end on a positive note. Professor Payne, thanks for having us.
Okay, great, thank you.